I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. We're going to begin this morning with some wild weather sweeping across the country. In parts of the Midwest, blizzard conditions are over, but snow is still falling from Iowa to Michigan this morning.
Already powerful winds and possible tornadoes tore through the Midwest, leaving behind uprooted trees and buildings without roofs. And to the south in Arkansas, the fire danger remains a concern after wildfires broke out across the state Wednesday. The National Weather Service warns that very dry air in that part of the country will linger into the weekend. We're going to have meteorologist Angie Lastman standing by with the latest on all things weather. But first, let's go to NBC News correspondent Maggie Vespa, who's on the ground in Stager, Illinois.
Joe, Savannah, good morning. It's like a battle of the seasons out here. I'm not sure if you can see, we have snow coming down here on this first day of spring. And then behind me, just behind that snow in the background, we have the destruction from one of the many reported tornadoes and windstorms that basically roared through this area overnight. We're seeing kind of pockets of destruction like this really all across the Midwest, especially in Illinois and Indiana. 8 tornadoes reported overnight in Illinois alone. So we had that violent winds, those violent winds and tornadoes here. And then we also had snow and blizzard-like conditions really coming to fruition elsewhere. We had blizzard warnings popping up from Kansas, basically up through Minnesota. Some areas, especially in Iowa, seeing more than a foot of snow overnight. And then it's really kind of been this patchwork of severe weather across the country. Down south, and we saw this over the weekend, it's continued. We've had those same crazy winds kicking up dust storms in the southwest, kind of as far south as like New Mexico and Texas. But here's the thing. As this system moves across the country, we've seen reports of the dust from New Mexico and Texas being pulled as far east as like St. Louis. One meteorologist in Iowa reporting brown snow, saying it appeared the snow had mixed with the dust as it was falling. And then finally, not to leave the southeast out, Florida dealing with brush fires right now, closing some major roadways. We saw families fleeing the flames, having to drive as fast as they could to get through it. Thankfully, and our desk is checking again this morning, we haven't seen any reports of injuries thanks to these storms or these tornadoes here in the Midwest. But suffice it to say, again, on this first day of spring, tornado season appears to be off and running with that icy grip of winter, guys, really still holding strong. I'll send it back to you.
Maggie, stay safe. Thank you very much.
Let's get a closer look at what to expect from the severe storms with your Morning News Now weather.
Angie Lastman's with us now. Hey, Angie, good morning.
Hi, guys. Good morning. We've got some snow. We've got some rain that we're going to deal with today. Thankfully, a lot of that severe activity winding down yesterday. We'll see the potential for some fire weather as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's start first with that same system that we've been tracking for the past couple of days. It's on the move. This morning, it's the snow across parts of the Great Lakes. And as we get into later today, it's the rain along the I-95 corridor specifically. It'll be heavy at that. That could slow you down for any of those evening plans that you may have. This is a pause at 8 p.m., so you can see that's kind of set up right along the coast. And we could see some lingering snow showers across parts of the Appalachians as well. The good news is this system's out of here by tomorrow for the most part. Most of the Northeast will be dry. We'll see this kind of little batch of some wet snow hanging out for parts of northern New England, but otherwise it's just going to be the cold winds across parts of the Northeast that'll get your attention if you live in that area. A lot of the wind alerts have expired. A lot of the winter alerts have expired, but we're still going to look at maybe some 30, 40 mile per hour wind gusts across parts of the Midwest and maybe the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic today. 30, 40 miles per hour, not quite as intense as what we saw yesterday, but still could impact some of those airports, and travel conditions might be delayed in a couple of spots, specifically Detroit, Chicago, Buffalo, Washington, D.C. Those are all locations that with the rain, the snow, and potential wind, I would watch for some delays. Philadelphia, Raleigh, also possible to see some delays there. Now, when it comes to the fire weather alerts, we've got kind of a couple of spots. We've got an area across parts of the plains and focused across the Rockies. We've got it along the Gulf Coast, and we've got Florida. You heard Maggie talking about those brush fires that we've seen for the eastern portions of the state of Florida. Today, 15 million people are waking up under these fire weather alerts. And again, this is extending from Daytona Beach through Fort Pierce, Melbourne, West Palm Beach, and Miami here with the dry vegetation, the dry conditions, leaving them with a critical risk. That goes for parts of Texas and New Mexico, stretching into Oklahoma and parts of Colorado as well. We'll watch for that as we get into the next probably day or so to continue, likely into the weekend with that dry air sticking around. Out west, different story. We've got our next Pacific storm that's going to basically slide into the coast, Washington, Oregon, seeing some of that heavy snow and the rain and the potential for strong winds. The snow setting up over the Cascades today, and then by tomorrow, some of that sets up over parts of the Rockies. You'll notice the rain sticks with our friends along the coast as well. This is something they'll deal with here for the next couple of days, and essentially maybe even into Sunday, we could pick up some additional rain. 3-4 inches close to the coast is where you'll see those higher amounts of rainfall. As far as the snowfall is concerned, about a foot in some spots, maybe 2 feet in some of those higher elevations across the Cascades and those northern Rockies. And this says spring, if anything does. It's like upper 70s in Norfolk today, mid 40s in Lexington, not that far away. So we've got some cool air in place from the Great Lakes, basically behind that storm system that we've been watching. We've seen our temperatures drop about 5 to 10 degrees below where they should be. So upper 50s for Atlanta today. We head to the upper 60s, though, for Philadelphia. Those temperatures are warmer than normal. And then we've got that clash of seasons continuing tomorrow.
When Buffalo's warmer than Atlanta,
that says everything,
things are a little upside down.
Yeah.
Find the cold front. It's exactly the game to play.
It's been kind of nice here, though. I've been loving it. All right. Thanks, Andrew.
You got it.
In Washington, President Trump is set today to take the first step toward dismantling the Department of Education. It's all part of his efforts to downsize the federal government.
Yeah, the White House has confirmed that Mr. Trump will sign an executive order to shut down the department at an event later today. Now, closing it does require congressional approval, but the president's actions could make work for its employees nearly impossible.
NBC News White House correspondent Aaron Gilchrist joins us now. Aaron, good morning. So what is going to be the immediate impact of this directive on the Department of Education itself? And just what does this mean for education more broadly?
Yeah, Joe, I don't know that it's clear what the immediate substantive impact would be that students in classrooms might see as a result of this executive order that we expect the president to sign around 4 o'clock this afternoon. At the same time, as you noted, this is going to be the moment where President Trump directs his Secretary of Education to start dismantling, as you said, this particular agency. And I'll read to you some of what we expect the executive order to say, that the Education Secretary should take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education while continuing to ensure the effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits. We're told by a senior administration officials that this effort would not impact Title I, would not impact student loans, would not impact services and aid for students with disabilities. Those things will not be touched, according to this senior administration official. And you have to remember, Joe and Savannah, that when Linda McMahon became the education secretary, one of the first things she did was send to her staff a note that talked about the agency's final mission, one in which they would start to shut down. And then just a few days later, we learned that the education department cut its staff of about 4,100 people across the country, almost in half, to about 2,000 employees. And that also impacted several departments, several offices inside the Department of Education. And she's also already begun the restructuring process that we know was mandated by an executive order that went out to all the federal departments. And so this effort to start closing down that agency or really minimizing the work that it does really is actually already underway.
Aaron, I mentioned a moment ago that closing the department needs an act of Congress. What does support look like over there? Is there enough, and will it head there anytime soon?
Well, we haven't heard anything about the White House constructing any legislation that would go to the Hill that would start to close down this department legislatively. Of course, we know this is an agency that was stood up about 45 years ago by an act of Congress during the Reagan administration is when it started operating. And at this point, despite the bipartisan support that we saw when this agency was created, right now we know that there's been a lot of support in general for what President Trump has been trying to do among Republicans on Capitol Hill. Democrats have indicated they would push back on this hard. The president indicated that he thought he would have to work. He knew he would have to work with Congress. The education secretary said the same thing. The teachers union, the National Education Association, has said that shutting down this department would negatively impact students, sending class sizes soaring, making higher education more expensive, they say, and also would create some issues with civil rights protections that really are at the heart of what the Department of Education has done over the last almost 45 years that it's been in existence, Joe and Savannah.
Aaron, let's turn to the Russia-Ukraine war. We know President Trump spoke with Ukraine's President Zelensky yesterday to brief him on the conversation that Mr. Trump had with Russia's President Putin. What do we know came out of those talks?
Well, there was additional agreement about a ceasefire on energy infrastructure in Ukraine. The Ukrainian president agreed with President Trump about that particular issue, under which we know there was some agreement with President Putin as well. I do want you to hear how the White House press secretary described parts of that phone call that lasted about an hour between President Trump and President Zelensky. Listen to this.
President Zelensky asked for additional air defense systems to protect his civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems, and President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure.
And so our understanding, Joe and Savannah, is that the next step here is for delegations from these countries involved to meet in Saudi Arabia over this weekend to try to hammer out some of the final details of a ceasefire agreement and to start talking about a broader ceasefire that might start the process of bringing an end to the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia.
We also want to ask you about some new NBC News reporting here. 3 U.S. defense officials have told us that the Trump administration is considering plans to create a militarized buffer zone along the southern border. What do we know at this point?
Yeah, our team that covers the Pentagon has been working on this story and has been able to find out from those sources you mentioned that the administration is considering creating this buffer zone and staffing it with U.S. troops that would intercept migrants who come across the border. As we understand it, a plan has not been approved at this point. It's not clear how far along the planning process is for this possibility. But if it were to come to fruition, our understanding, Joe and Savannah, is that this zone would be along the New Mexico border. And it would be sort of a holding area for migrants that come into the country before they're handed over to ICE and CBP authorities to start the deportation process that this administration has been pushing so hard with, Joe and Savannah.
All right, Aaron Gilchrist in Washington. Aaron, thank you.
Well, the Trump administration is also planning to close hundreds of Social Security Administration field offices and cut thousands of jobs. This comes as some Social Security recipients may need to verify their identity in person soon. NBC News correspondent Liz Kreutz has more on the potential impact of these changes.
A major change coming to Social Security in an effort to crack down on fraudulent claims. The Trump administration planning to impose stricter measures on how to verify a person's identity. Soon, people will no longer be able to prove their identity over the phone, meaning those who can't do so using the online service have to go in person. The change comes as the agency plans to close dozens of Social Security offices nationwide and lay off thousands of workers. The tightening measures coming from DOJ and Elon Musk, who is using claims of voter fraud and illegal immigration to make the pitch for cuts, allegations for which he hasn't offered evidence and experts say is inaccurate.
By using entitlements fraud, the Democrats have been able to attract and retain vast numbers of illegal immigrants.
And buy voters.
And buy voters, exactly.
While the Trump administration has repeatedly said it isn't cutting benefits, just potential fraud, advocates warn those with mobility issues or limited access to the internet will suffer.
How important is the phone service at the Social Security Administration?
Oh, it's extremely important. It's going to make field offices more crowded. It's going to make it more difficult to access the benefits that we have all earned.
Liz Kreutz, NBC News.
President Trump is clashing with a growing number of federal judges who have temporarily blocked some of his actions. One judge issued a new warning to the administration yesterday, saying there will be consequences if they don't answer his questions. NBC's Garrett Hake has the details.
President Trump intensifying his clash with the courts, calling out federal judges he argues are intentionally trying to derail his agenda, including a judge who temporarily blocked Trump's invocation of an 18th century law to deport nearly 300 undocumented migrants and alleged gang members to a prison in El Salvador.
He actually said we shouldn't be able to take criminals, killers, murderers, horrible, the worst people, gang members, gang leaders, that we shouldn't be allowed to take them out of our country. Well, that's a presidential job. That's not for a local judge to be making that determination.
That judge granting the administration one more day to respond to questions about those Saturday deportation flights and warning of, quote, consequences if he learns the government deliberately ignored his order to turn the planes around.
I never did defy a court order.
And you wouldn't in the future?
No, you can't do that.
We pressed the White House about those flights. Will those flights to El Salvador continue while this case is being appealed?
We don't have any flights planned specifically, but we will continue with the mass deportations. This is an activist judge who is trying to usurp the president's authority.
Federal law enforcement says the deported migrants include members of two gangs the president has designated as terrorist organizations, Tren de Aragua and MS-13. In a court filing, a senior ICE agent says, quote, many of the TDA gang members had not committed crimes in the U.S., but that does not mean they pose a limited threat. It comes as family members of some of those sent to El Salvador argue their loved ones are not gang members. Miralise Cacique recognized her son in a video from the prison. She says he was undocumented, but not in a gang. He has no criminal record. They should send him back to Venezuela, she says. The White House refusing to reveal details about those deported on the flights, including names, saying they trust ICE and Border Patrol investigators.
We are not going to reveal operational details about a counterterrorism operation. They have the highest degree of professionalism, and they were 100% confident in the individuals that were sent home on these flights.
So far, NBC News has tracked 37 rulings from federal judges that have at least temporarily blocked actions taken by President Trump, with a federal judge blocking his executive order banning transgender people from military service. The Trump administration paused $175 million in federal funding to his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, for allowing a transgender athlete to compete on the women's swim team.
Our thanks to Garrett Haake for that report. A spokesperson for the University of Pennsylvania said it is aware of media reports about that suspension, but the university has not received any official notification or details.
Now, the Federal Reserve is weighing in on the economy for the first time since President Trump imposed those tariffs on some imports. Yesterday, the Fed announced it was holding interest rates steady at around 4.3%. Now, that means the rate you borrow at for mortgages, for your credit cards, auto loans, it's likely to stay about the same for now.
Stocks did go higher on the news that rates are remaining steady. The Dow Jones, S&P 500, and NASDAQ all closed up yesterday. But the Fed also sent out some mixed messages on where it sees the economy going this year. It's warning about increased inflation, the trade wars, and the recent mass firings at the federal government.
For more on this, let's bring in Caleb Silver. He is editor-in-chief at Investopedia. Of course, a friend of the show, Caleb. Always great to have you here. Good morning. Okay, so let's talk about the mixed messages that Joe just mentioned, because there was this concern expressed, which I think was expected, between inflation and tariffs, but then also, like, sort of this potential for cuts later this year. What do you make of those?
Well, that's both things playing at each other. The Fed chair saying that inflation is coming from an exogenous source. What's that source? It's tariffs, but we yet don't know the impact of those. April 2nd is when most of those go into effect. So the Fed has lowered its growth projections. It's raised its inflation outlook, and that looks like what we call stagflation, when you have rising prices but a slowing economy, which means the Fed may be forced to cut a couple of times this year. There was talk that maybe it might only be one. We know the president wants lower interest rates. They may be forced into cutting those rates to jumpstart the economy.
On Wall Street, the markets did close higher yesterday. It's been kind of quiet this week compared to a volatile past couple of weeks. What is it investors are seeing and hearing right now?
It's the notion that there'll be a couple of rate cuts. When rates go lower, that means higher profits for companies, and that's what investors are investing in. They want higher profits. That usually means higher stock prices, so they're excited about that. You see a sell-off back this morning, so it's been a lot of a push and pull. But since Election Day, the S&P 500 is now down 3.5%. The Dow's pretty flat. So we had that big run-up in the stock market after the election. Everybody think there'd be deregulation, open for business, but tariffs are now putting the shadow over the economy and probably going to slow it, and that's what the Fed is looking at. But they don't know if that's going to be a very temporary thing, what they call transitory, or if this is a long-term effect that's going to mean prices are going to be higher for Americans. We should probably expect that.
What is the take-home right now for any average person?
Yeah, rates are going to stay where they are for the near term, and we know prices are going to rise. So expect more inflation, not rampant inflation like we had in 2021, 2022, but higher prices and no rate cuts for the time being. Stick with what you see right now. This is the economy we're in.
All right, Caleb Silver, thanks as always.
This morning, American Joshua Reeby is back on U.S. soil. He is the last person believed to see missing student Sudiksha Kunanki alive in the Dominican Republic. NBC News is first to report on Reeby's return to the U.S. His attorneys allege he was detained for days in the Caribbean nation and his passport was confiscated while he was questioned over Kunanki's disappearance. He has not been charged and no suspects have been named. Kunanki was last seen in this surveillance footage at her hotel in Punta Cana. The University of Pittsburgh Jr. was on spring break. when she disappeared.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.